Hello there, my name is Daniel Marich, and welcome to my Cybersecurity Vulnerability Assessment presentation, Understanding the Essential Elements. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'd like you all to get signed up at my Poll Everywhere page. The easiest way to do it would be to go ahead and scan this QR code here with your smartphone, and you can answer the question through your smartphone, or you can type in this link into your browser. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat as well. Um, this way you can register and then you can answer the question, what should cybersecurity efforts protect within an organization? So a simple 1 to 2 word answer, it's going to produce a word cloud for us. So again, what should cybersecurity efforts protect within an organization? All right, great. All right, so while you're doing that, let me quickly go over our presentation outline. Have a brief welcome. We'll answer the question, what is cybersecurity in a general sense? We'll discuss cybersecurity frameworks. Then we'll talk about the objective of a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. And then we'll get into the real meat of the presentation, the essential elements of the cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. And then we'll have a brief summary and some final thoughts. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, my name is Daniel Marich. I have an MBA from California State University, San Bernardino in cybersecurity and supply chain management. I have over 20 years in information technology operations, web development, and IT project management. As a director of IT operations at an SEO company, I spent a lot of time learning about network segmentation and endpoint protection as I chased around worms and malware in the sales staff network. Um, so I learned the hard way about a lot of these concepts. If you'd like to contact me, there's my email address, and I'd be honored to connect with you on LinkedIn. There's my profile link. At any time you want to ask me any questions, please feel free to turn on your mic and let me know, or put it in the chat. Okay, so let's take a quick moment to take a look at your guys' answers. And yes, sure enough, data is the big one. Protecting data with our cybersecurity efforts, protecting hardware, the database, the business, the employee, information, processes. This is a good one. Business processes, protecting, those types of things that bring value to the customer, the website, the wireless network, customer information. Here, PII, personal identifiable information. So I like this. Very good. This is a great start. So I think all of you have a good grip of what cybersecurity does for an organization. All right, let's go ahead and get back to our PowerPoint presentation. All right, so what is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity refers to the practice of protecting computers, networks, and data from unauthorized access, attacks, and damage, as you guys all indicated in that word cloud. So a comprehensive information security strategy includes policies and security controls that minimize threats to these three crucial components, right? So these components are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is keeping your data confidential, either through encryption, or making sure that only the right people access the right data at the right time. Integrity is making sure that the data hasn't been damaged or modified. This might involve making sure that your software updates are legitimate through digital signatures. So that's keeping things, integrity, to be trustworthy, that everything is trustworthy. Availability, this has a lot to do with making sure that the stakeholders and the users have access to the information in a timely manner. A big part of this is redundancy, making sure that the network has fail-safes, that there are workarounds, that there are multiple network switches, maybe having RAID hardware set up on your server. So if one of the hard drives go down, it can continue to provide the information. So these three components give us guidelines into how to secure our data and computer and our networks. All right, so these guidelines, specifically CIA Triad, is something that is given to us by the NIST cybersecurity framework, which specifically refers to the National Institute of Standards and Technology under the U.S. Department of Commerce. So this is a federal guidelines. They have a tremendous amount of documentation, and this presentation will pull a lot of information from NIST. But there are other frameworks out there. The Center for Internet Security is another framework. It's not quite as robust, but provides a lot of guidelines and is developed by a nonprofit organization. The framework offers actionable guidelines and benchmarks that organizations can implement to enhance their cybersecurity posture. There's also the HIPAA security rule, which refers to how to protect electronic health information. Those are guidelines that have to be followed to protect all of our health information within the United States, as well as ISO, which is an international organization that sets the standard for international businesses and organizations based in Europe and throughout the world. NIST recently went through an update of its cybersecurity framework, which was released back in February 2024, and now they are at the 2.0 level where they added governance to every aspect of the framework. All right, so what is the objective of a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, right? So the definition is vulnerability assessment is a systematic process of identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing vulnerabilities in systems aiming to enhance security resilience, right? So the objective is by conducting vulnerability assessments, organizations can proactively manage risk and protect critical assets from potential threats. Protecting critical assets is the objective of our cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, right? If you don't protect your critical assets, you end up with security breaches, all right? So if you wouldn't mind, answer the question in the chat. Have you been impacted by a cybersecurity breach? Go ahead and put some your answers in the chat. If you have, maybe you can give us an example of what it was or the context. In the meantime, we'll talk about a couple security breaches. The Equifax is a well-studied breach that happened in 2017 that involved a Linux server that wasn't being updated on a regular basis. Its encryption software was not being updated because it wasn't listed as part of the inventory within the company. For some reason, whenever all the other Linux servers got updated, this one didn't, and a hacker found it and was able to expose personal data for 147 million people. Locally here, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department had a ransomware attack in April of 2023, and even though they paid out $1.1 million to get the key, they still are paying out money to upgrade their entire system to prevent this from happening in the future. And hospitals have become a real emerging industry for cybersecurity attacks. It's been becoming very dangerous for the, hospitals that have everything locked down all of a sudden because of ransomware, where potential fatal mistakes might happen. So this is an example of impacting the health and actually hurting people. More than just their information being stolen. All right, so if I look here in the chat, I noticed that there are, yes, a lot of you have been impacted by cybersecurity breaches. I see here one, the AT&T breach. Yes, a lot of us have been impacted by that one. And AT&T has been giving free complimentary credit monitoring with Experian for a lot of us who've been impacted by that breach. They tell us that not our personal information hasn't been exposed, but we do have access to some free credit monitoring, and I would encourage you all to take care of that. All right, so let's get into the essential elements of a cybersecurity attack. First, we want to establish the objectives and the scope. We want to define assessment goals and scope to focus on specific systems and assets, all right? Maybe the scope is deciding on how to get up to speed in our regulation requirements. Maybe it's focusing on critical infrastructure or network segments or our cloud environment. Maybe it has to do with implementing a new technology. We want to make sure that when we implement it, we're not all of a sudden vulnerable when we bring those things online. So these are different ways to create a scope for your cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. You want to clearly define it in the beginning so you don't get what's called scope creep, where all of a sudden you find yourself expanding the scope to include more and more different aspects of your network or your organization, and it slows down the ability to finish your cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. So next, we want to identify the assets. All right, we want to identify the assets that are within the scope of the cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, right? Could they be hardware assets, software assets, data assets, cloud assets, maybe Internet of Things devices? Are we just looking at only the website? Are we looking at our backend database server? Are we looking at our firewalls? What is the scope? And then clearly identifying the assets that fall under that scope. All right, then what would be the threats to that asset, right? So a lot of times we'll do what's called a tabletop exercise where stakeholders will get involved in determining and brainstorming what are the different threats to the particular asset. We'll sit around a table and we'll brainstorm out what are the external threats, what are the internal threats. Are there, nation states known as APTs that constantly are hammering away at our network through our website and emails to get access to our data and our information? Maybe some proprietary software that they want to use for their own businesses. Emerging threats such as zero-day exploits, where all of a sudden we find out that something is vulnerable and it's been sitting there for a while and we have 0 days to fix it. We have to address it right away. Maybe compliance issues have to be addressed. So we want to go through a threat assessment to determine what are all the possible threats to our assets. Then we get into vulnerability identification. We want to use automated tools and manual techniques to identify weaknesses in the system. Now we have automated tools that are scanners or web application scanners, which will identify open ports or whether operating systems need to be updated, maybe holes in our wireless network. Penetration test tools are possibly part of a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, but not always. It really depends on the scope. If you're doing a comprehensive vulnerability assessment for the whole organization, maybe you'll want to conduct a penetration test. Maybe you have someone internally do it. Maybe you have someone externally do it, has no information about your organization. So it depends on the scope. Penetration tests are not the same as a vulnerability assessment, but can be part of the vulnerability assessment. Also, code reviews, going through and making sure the code is using the most up-to-date libraries. Manually going through and assessing your security requirements, making sure your policies for that particular area are all up to date. Reviewing system configurations and settings. And how about user permissions and user access? Under the concept of least privileged, you want to make sure that your users are not all of a sudden having more access than they need to fulfill their responsibilities. That's the concept of least privilege. Let's say a user worked in one position in the company and then moved to another position in the company. All right, you want to make sure that the access they had for the previous position has been turned off, so they're not all of a sudden building more and more access to your overall network. So if they get compromised by somebody who gets their information and access through their account, they are only accessing the least amount of privileges required to do that job responsibility. So here's a quick example of a report from OpenVAS appliance that shows some vulnerabilities and their severity. And I would like to point out, first of all, that this is only a tool. You want to use this to get a good inventory of all the vulnerabilities, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you are assessing all of the vulnerabilities independently of the tool. Like a number of low severity vulnerabilities strung together could result in a hacker penetrating your system. So it's a great tool to inventory your vulnerabilities, but the analysis comes down to you and your stakeholders. All right. So what is a vulnerability analysis? You want to analyze identified vulnerabilities to determine their potential impact and severity, right? So you want to say, well, if this vulnerability was exploited, what would be the impact on business and what would be the severity of that impact? And a lot of times you want to go through a process of rating that severity, low, medium, high, maybe a scale of 1 to 10, all depending on how you want to approach it within the organization, and your framework also will give guidance in that regards. Then the next stage of the vulnerability analysis is what's called determining the risk level. So the way you do that is likelihood of something being exploited times the impact will give you your overall security risk. So a vulnerability can be exploited by a threat. How likely is that to happen? And if it is exploited, what would be the business impact? So this is a process of analyzing all of your vulnerabilities and determining what the risk level is if they are exploited. So this particular formula, likelihood times impact equals risk, is something that comes out of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And here we have a scale where the highest impact and the highest likelihood vulnerabilities, if exploited, results in those having the highest risk to the company. So this has to be done for every single vulnerability, right? So if you've got a database that hasn't been updated with this encryption technology in quite a while, and it is constantly being scanned because it sits with an open internet face to it, then because it has remote access for users, this is something that has to be addressed right away. Maybe, a web page doesn't have to be addressed right away. So you want to use this to kind of rank and prioritize all of the vulnerabilities. Then you make a report. So you document all the findings, including risk assessments and recommended mitigation strategies. All right. So that is the next step here is what are the mitigation strategies? What you're doing here is you're trying to create your current profile. All right. And these are all the things that are currently an issue. And here they are ranked by the most risk to the least risky in regards to impact and likelihood. Then you offer these mitigation strategies so you can get to what's called your target profile, current profile, and your target profile. And this document provides information to all the stakeholders, whether it's the IT people, whether it's your C-level executives, giving them a roadmap to decide on what needs to be addressed as soon as possible. Then you actually implement your mitigation. Right? You implement patches, updates, configuration changes, whatever it takes to address the identified vulnerabilities. So this particular section is feedback from your leadership saying, okay, deal with this, deal with that, deal with this. We can have a risk appetite to not deal with these right now because we only have so much staff, so much time, so much budget. All right. So the last critical element here is review and continuous improvements. You want to go through and conduct another vulnerability assessment in maybe a couple months' time, maybe a year, depends on how your organization. So you want to review to see if the mitigation efforts were effective, right? Did they actually update the encryption on that server, right? Have we made our passwords more robust? These are the types of things that you want to make sure are addressed in the next cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. Okay, so this is a continuous process. Right? I think that's important to recognize here that one, it's a continuous process, and two, it has to reflect your company. All right, so we've talked about the overall essential elements of a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. Okay, we establish objectives and scope, we identify assets, we have a threat assessment, vulnerability identification, vulnerability analysis, reporting, mitigation planning, and review and continuous improvements. So at this time, I want to know, do you have any questions? Would you like to discuss anything further? I know there's been a lot to take in because this is the tip of the iceberg of a very complicated subject that can be very flexible and determined mostly by the organization's overall cybersecurity profile and risk appetite, right? So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. But if you don't, I have a question for you. How often should an organization conduct a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment? All right. So I do see some answers like once a month, twice a year. Um, Depends. I like that answer. Depends. I think that that's what the message is here, is that it really depends on your organization. Maybe you want to do an internal vulnerability assessment every 2 to 3 times a year, and then hire a third party to do one on an annual basis. So you really want to fit your vulnerability assessments within your organizational profile. So here are my final thoughts. And leading off of that, you want to be adaptable to your organizational context. You want to fit your cybersecurity to the mission of your organization, just like you fit your IT department and your IT requirements to your organizational mission. Cybersecurity should be part of that. Know your organizational assets. Make sure you're inventorying everything. Nothing is hiding that hasn't been addressed. That everything, and there are a lot of tools that can help with this, because the fact of the matter is you can't protect what you don't know you have. So make sure that you know everything about your inventory in regards to IT hardware, software, etc. Right? Do a regular review. There's always something changing. There's always something evolving in your IT profile. You want to have cybersecurity should be part of the system development life cycle, always growing every step of the way. When you add a new server on, cybersecurity should be considered in that process. When you're updating software, cybersecurity should be considered in that process, all right? Cyber attacks are continuously evolving, so you should too. Let's all remember that this is a lifelong learning process where we are continually growing as the IT world grows, cybersecurity grows, and we have to be continuously on the forefront. And doing consistent cybersecurity vulnerability assessments is a big part of that. So thank you very much for your time. I'd be honored to connect with you on LinkedIn. If you have any other questions, or maybe you want access to the PowerPoint slides, please feel free to send me an email. It's been a pleasure to share this information with you, and I wish you all the best in your cybersecurity industry careers ahead. Thank you very much.